could be the reason why there is not a lot of interest globally in what happens in the country. But naturally, when you take a look at the natural beauty of the country, there is a lot of interest that, people from Europe, people from Russia, Japan, Australia, different countries, they have a lot of interest in the natural beauty of the country. And that is seen in the number of tourists we get every single year. And that is what my talk is going to be based upon. Let me just ask you a question. When you think about a place like, let's say, the Hilton, or the Four Seasons, or any of the other big hotel chains, what do you think about? I'm pretty sure it's mostly about, beautiful rooms, good customer service, great gym, swimming pool, restaurants, different restaurants. So as a country, Maldives has become one big hotel. When anyone talks about Maldives, that's all people think about. It's a beautiful place, you get different resorts, it's very expensive, but it's very beautiful, and I'll show you. So this is the Maldives. A group of islands in the Maldives. Maldives. So this is primarily the picture that I'm going to be showing you now is how people see Maldives. Not Maldivians, but people other than Maldivians. It's beautiful, isn't it? So, okay. A lot of people think Maldives, like I said, Maldives is just a hotel, just a resort. No, it's not. It has a history of about 2,500 years. So before, we do have archaeological evidence to suggest that there was people were living in the Maldives even before Christ. So it is a very, very old country. And someone actually said that the people actually think, because we're so close to the sea, that some of the people in the Maldives can actually breathe underwater. No. And although what you see today, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is about how women particularly are a disadvantaged group in the country, historically, the Maldives was a matriarchal society. Women had a lot of power. Women control both the economic and the social issues for a very long time. There were 2 queens who reigned the country for a very long time. And no, it's not a paradise. Well, if you go there for a couple of days, stay in one of those 5-star hotels, it could be a paradise. But as a country, no, it's not a paradise. So it's a traditional Maldivian woman. Traditionally, they don't wear the veil. We were a Buddhist country for about more than 1,000 years. And it was only in 1153 that we became a Muslim country. But even then, for a very long time, we did not have strict Islamic codes within the country. So now we see the Maldives that's closer to what we see as a Maldivian, what we experience. So this doesn't seem like something that should happen in paradise now, does it? And that's not how you pepper spray, really. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about the present situation in the country. Now, when I told you that Maldives has not had strict Islamic codes or the Islamic Sharia practice in the country up until around the 1990s. But when you take a look at the situation now, it's much worse. there has been a huge increase in religious extremism, and that is seen in what's happening in the country today. This particularly, if you can recognize that flag, Maldives has become part of the recruiting process of organizations like the ISIS. We have about, like I said, we have about 300,000 people in the entire population. But last year alone, we had about 200 people who went and joined the ISIS and fought in Syria. So that's a huge number for such a small population. And this is a picture from one of the protests. It was actually a surprise. This was sort of the first time, I suppose, we realized the hold of groups like the ISIS on the population. This is a protest that was staged by a group of religious extremists holding the ISIS flag and talking about doing away with the constitution, doing away with democracy, and bringing back what they call the real Islamic Sharia to the country. So this is not something that happened suddenly. Maldives has been seeing that regression into extremism from a very long time. Since the 1990s, we've been seeing people becoming more and more extremist, and we've seen fundamentalist ideology creeping up in the country. But nothing was done to ensure that there was enough advocacy, there was enough work to stop that sort of thought. It was actually in the first democratic elections in the country were held in 2010. So for the last 30 years, we've had a dictatorial regime who've suppressed everything from freedom of expression, freedom of religion, to any sort of democratic principle that we could have. But what happened is, during that 30 years, he also suppressed the voices of the extremists. So they were not allowed to preach their extremist ideologies. But what happened after the 2010 election was that the new president, who came with promises of democratic freedoms, he opened up the country to everyone. So whatever views you had, you were able to express it. I mean, in principle, that's a good idea. But in a country where there were so many people who were willing and open to just move out into the arena and convert a lot of people into this form of extreme Islam, that wasn't such a good idea. So what happened was, from that moment onwards, religious extremist groups became more and more popular with the people. They started having sermons every week, and these sermons included a lot about how to suppress women, how women should not be working, how women should not be equal to men. So that sort of promotion has led to this moment where we now know that the Maldives is part of the extremist movement in the world. But the problem is, the world, the global community doesn't really see Maldives for this. They only see Maldives for what I showed you earlier. Maldives is part of the UN, Maldives is part of the major human rights conventions, and they do report to the human rights committees. But what happens when they report these? What happens when Maldives is evaluated by these committees? Well, the government comes up with some sort of excuse to say, well, we are doing the best we can. We are a developing country. We don't have all the necessary resources of a developed country. Therefore, we should be given some, the UN should cut us some slack because we're a developing country. And that's left at that point. There is no probing into what's really happening in the country. The last CEDAW report talked about the progress made by the government in the front of ensuring women had equal rights as men. But what the committee didn't ask was why there has been absolutely no progress made since the first CEDAW country report. That question was never asked. Maldives has always had a moratorium on the death penalty, which means although the death penalty is in the legislation, it has never been implemented. But recently, just a year ago, that moratorium was lifted. And now death penalty will be implemented in the country. International community talked about it, but there has been no concerted effort to pressure the government to ensure that we do not regress in our human rights commitments. I suppose 300,000 people are not that important for the global community when they have so many other things to worry about. But those 300,000 people still face the same problems faced by other larger developed countries. And that's the truth. So, I'll tell you an example, give you an example of the results of this rising religious extremism. I had a friend who worked at the Human Rights Commission for 2 years, and then he went on to work as a journalist. He was a very prolific human rights defender. He was very engaged in showing to the people the real face of religious extremists. He was writing articles about what the religious extremists were actually doing and how political they were, and how little relationship they had to actually what people thought the religion was. So he was writing articles, he was criticizing these people, he was very vocal, very active. And then in last year, on August, he disappeared. And we've not found him since then. The government has not done anything to find him. The law enforcement have been they've not taken this issue seriously, and he's been missing since 2014, August. And there have been some work by the NGOs in order to try and get the government to work more seriously in finding him. But to this day, he remains missing, someone who's worked tirelessly against religious extremism. And these are real problems. And although it is one person out of the 300,000, it is a huge problem. For me, it is a huge problem for a lot of people in the country, although it may not be a huge problem for the global community. The significance of his disappearance is that after this, and even before this, really, we've seen a somehow more brazen propaganda by religious extremists. A couple of months ago, a human rights defender was stabbed was knifed in the head, and although he survived, it was a serious attack. And we're seeing more and more brazen attacks in the country. We're seeing more and more regression from the state that we were in before to the present day, to what we're seeing today. And in reality, everyone knows this is happening. The government knows this is happening. The only democratically elected president who tried to bring about democratic reform, who tried to reconcile the sort of repression we've seen for the past 30 years, and who tried to make Maldives a more liberal, a more free-thinking country, is now in jail. And the present government is working, in a way, hand in hand with the religious extremists, because they were very, very important for the government, because they were significant in bringing down the former president's regime. So the former president, like I said, he came to power in 2010, but was brought down by a coup in 2012, and the religious groups were instrumental in overthrowing the president. So, once more, just some quick statistics about, what a lot of people call paradise. So 1 in 3 women between the ages of 14 and 59 have experienced some form of physical and or sexual abuse in their lifetimes. And approximately 1 in 8 women aged 15 to 49, it's about 12.2%, reported that they have been sexually abused before the age of 15. Domestic violence is a huge problem in the country. And we have 85 members in the parliament, and only 5 of them are women. And in a study that we did in 2012, we found that there were more women today than in 2005, which was when we first did the study, and then we repeated in 2012. More women today who believe that men have a religious duty to beat women, and that the laws, the legislation that prevent that from happening was blasphemous. They were entirely un-Islamic, against religion, and should not be there. So this is sort of a snapshot of the situation. This is sort of the present situation in what the global community thinks to be a paradise. I would just like to very briefly talk about a specific example of how difficult it is for women particularly to get justice in the country. And this is primarily because the legal system at the moment is heavily based on the Islamic Sharia. The legal system is not based on evidence and the jurisprudence that we should be seeing from a developing country that's had a very progressive legal system before. What we're seeing now is that all the legislations that we see passed in the parliament have to be vetted against Sharia, whether they're compatible with Islamic Sharia. And if they're not, then they have to be, which means the progressive element of these legislations are being taken out. So, in 2014, there was a case that came to even the international limelight when a 15-year-old girl was sentenced to be flogged. Do you all know what flogging means? So it's a punishment that's prescribed in Islamic Sharia for fornication. So, and primarily this punishment is meted out against women. So they have to be, they're kept in a public place, they're bent over, and their backs are beaten with a leather device. I don't know. It's really not a whip, but it's more like a mace, you know, a baton of sort. But it's made with leather, and you know, it's supposedly the punishment for fornication. So this 15-year-old girl was sentenced to be flogged. But what is interesting is, okay, before we go to that, let's just have a look at some of the most widely convicted criminal offences in the Maldives. Surprising. Fornication, expressions against Islam, sexual abuse, prostitution, homosexuality, rape, murder. So this is a basic idea of what the justice system encounters and what they meet sentences out every single day. But interestingly, more significant than cases of murder to the justice system are cases of fornication, expression against Islam, and even cases of homosexuality. So we're seeing a society, we're seeing a country that's slowly degenerating into this dark ages where we're not seeing any element of democracy. But that's okay for some people. For those people who are promoting these ideas, that's okay. But I'd like to say it's also been okay for the international community who've been very, very complacent with what's happening in the country. So we now go back to the case that I was talking about. So this girl, I mean, this is just a representation, it's not the girl. The girl that I was talking about had been abused by her stepfather for almost 6 years. And that issue was never dealt with by the justice system. So how did this issue come to the limelight? What happened was she got pregnant to her stepfather. And the stepfather and her mother quickly, when she gave birth, they killed the baby. And that was when the issue came to the notice of the police. So they arrested both the stepfather, the mother, and the girl. And and what they did was they started an investigation. So during the investigation, she was a minor, but she was actually questioned without the presence of a lawyer. They questioned her whether she's had any sexual experiences with anyone other than her stepfather, and she said yes. And so that became fornication. So the police thought, okay, she's had sex outside of marriage, that amounts to a criminal offence, so we had to get her to the Prosecutor General's office as a criminal offence so that she should be punished for it. No one, not the law enforcement, not the Juvenile Justice Unit, not the Ministry of Gender and Child Welfare, none of these institutions ever thought to question the situation which the girl was in. None of them thought that she was someone who had suffered a lot of trauma for the last 6 years. Since she was about 9 years old, she was being abused by her stepfather. And all they cared about was, okay, we've got a case of fornication, this has to be punished. That's what the Islamic Sharia says. So they found that, like I said, they found that she had committed the act of fornication. Now, the question is, why did they not consider to probe this issue further? Because if they had, they would have found out something that was very, very pertinent. The girl, I'll tell you a little more about it before I go into this. So she was then, the case was sent to the Prosecutor General's office, who thought that there was enough evidence to prosecute this 15-year-old girl. And the PG's office sent it to the juvenile court, where the judge saw that she was liable to be flogged. At the first hearing, the judge questioned the girl, asking her, "Did you fornicate?" And she said, "Yes." At first, she said she didn't actually know the meaning. The lawyer was there, but the judge did not give an opportunity for the lawyer to respond. So the judge asked her, "Do you know the meaning of fornication?" And he explained it to her, and she said yes. Now, what really happened was, she thought she was having a sexual relation of her own will, simply for one reason only. When her stepfather had sex with her, she was tied up. When this person had sex with her, she was not tied up. So she thought that was giving consent. And to the government authorities, that was okay. She had to be punished. So, okay, this is all. So we conducted, when this issue came to limelight, the Human Rights Commission decided to conduct an investigation. And we found that there were gross human rights violations by all the concerned authorities. And we prepared a report, and the case was actually appealed at the High Court. And interestingly, this was the first time in the history that the High Court allowed for an independent institution to act as an amicus curiae, or a friend of the court, where we were allowed to present the report and also speak on behalf of the girl. So let me just give you quickly, very briefly, the experience of what happened at the court. I went to represent the girl on behalf of the Human Rights Commission, and she was sitting there with her lawyer, and during the trial, she was laughing, and then all of a sudden she would just start to cry. and then she would laugh again. And the High Court judges decided that she should not be in the court. Now imagine this. She's been abused for about 6 years, and now she's in court. She was in court initially, and she was sentenced to be flogged. She was victimized, and then now she's in court again. She's been re-victimized over and over and over again, simply because the authorities felt that she had fornicated and she should be punished. So, fortunately, the High Court judges allowed the girl not to be in the court during the process. And so after we presented the case, after we showed that the state had violated the rights of the girl, and that the juvenile court, this is very important, the juvenile court had actually gotten it wrong, that's what we said in the report, that they had not considered the fact that she was suffering from PTSD. And there was medical documentation to support it, and there was also logic, which they obviously didn't have. But they did not consider, and this is very, very implicitly stated in the juvenile court verdict, that they did not consider PTSD to be a serious enough mental condition for her to not have understood what she was doing when she had sex with the person. So, luckily, after all the evidence was presented, the High Court overturned the verdict, and she was set free. But what is important about this case is that this is just one of the cases that came to the limelight. There are thousands of cases like this currently in the courts within the criminal justice system who will not be lucky enough to have the case overturned by the High Court, who will not be lucky enough to have an appeal process itself. But this is going on, this is happening right as we speak. Now, as a conclusion, after we appealed at the High Court and we came out with a report, there is currently a criminal investigation against me and the Human Rights Commission for 2 reasons. One, the contempt of court, by saying that the juvenile court got it wrong, and also for speaking against an established punishment in the Islamic Sharia. So that's, in a way, we were able to get the High Court to overturn the verdict, but we also got retaliation in response to what we did. This is the situation of what a lot of people think to be a paradise on earth. This is a situation of what a lot of international community feels that, it is not such a serious situation. But this is happening every single day. We're not so well known for the social issues, for the social problems as some of the other South Asian countries. But nonetheless, the point here is that Maldives is also a country with people living in them. We do face similar, if not even worse problems than some of the countries in Asia. We're such a small community. There is limited, there is scarcity of land, and the housing problem is a huge problem when you consider the social issues taking place. There is sexual abuse, there is domestic violence, but all of this, all the problems that we face are dwarfed by the insistency of the governments and other state institutions to abide by the Islamic Sharia, which therefore makes us blind to what's actually happening. Corporal punishment is still being meted out to people. The death penalty is still there. Gender equality is non-existent. But still, we are seen as a paradise, and that's what I wanted to say, that we are not a paradise. We have a lot of problems that need to be addressed, and all these problems will only be addressed the moment that we start seeing the country for a country and not as a tourist destination, as a hotel, as a paradise on earth. Thank you.